Salute, my Quickclassics friends. Back in the saddle with Quickclassics. Excited to be doing this again. My lighting this morning has me looking like one of the Kryptonian judges from the Christopher Reeve Superman. I'll have to work on my lighting for the next episode. But I wanted to launch back into the Quickclassics episodes and today talk about education, specifically classical education. And education seems to be something that's on everybody's mind these days. But I should be hasty to enunciate that classical education bears very little resemblance to what you're going to find in the public school system and most of higher education. And I know that from having taught in the public school system myself and in higher education for the last 20 plus years. Um, but classical education can be implemented broadly and with a minimum of expense, and it has a long history, a centuries long, millennia long history of producing good results. So, in this age of changing educational paradigms for good or ill, classical education is becoming a more popular alternative, which is interesting, where once it used to be the standard. What is classical education, you might ask? Well, when we say classical, of course, if you're a fan of this channel, what we're talking about is the ancient Mediterranean world, the Greeks, the Romans, and by proxy, the Levantine peoples like the Jews. All of those literatures and cultures contribute to this corpus of history and poetry and prose that form the basis of the curriculum for classical education. Classical education, even in this country, has been foundational in terms of not only basic education but also knowledge and learning applied to everyday life. And to understand classical education, you really have to start with the classical virtues, and those are the pursuit of what is good, the pursuit of what is beautiful, and the pursuit of what is true. And in the Greek world, this took the form of the trivium, which was composed of, as the name suggests, three phases of education known as the grammar, logic, and rhetoric phases. There's also a quadrivium, which is four components, which is kind of a higher education, and it's from these seven that we get the classical liberal arts. But we'll talk about the quadrivium in another episode. But I may allude to it later, so I wanted to at least make you aware of what the quadrivium, that it's actually part of the classical rubric. And so the beginning phase is the grammar phase, which corresponds roughly to elementary school. And if you talk to your grandparents or older relatives or people who went to elementary school earlier on in the 20th century, they may have actually gone to an elementary school where it was called a grammar school. And the reason it was called a grammar school is because that was the first phase of classical education. What did that involve? Well, it was usually rooted in rote memory, lots of memorization. Song and nursery rhymes were used in order to do this. Latin tended to be, maybe a little bit of Greek, but usually Latin tended to be the basis for learning in the grammar phase. Latin was a very wide-spoken language for centuries. But it could really be any language. But in terms of pure classical education, Latin is usually the foundation for that. Again, with a little bit of Greek, usually. But Latin, studying any language should be done at this phase, the elementary phase, because kids' brains are sponges; they're absorbing everything. And the Greeks knew this. People in the classical world, the Romans, they knew that this was the case, and so they could harness it, and kids were just learning all kinds of things. And anybody who studied a language other than your own knows that course of study improves the knowledge of your mother tongue. And so that was the grammar phase. The next phase was the logic phase, which corresponds roughly to junior high. And because you've got kids moving into a preteen phase of their life, they're more argumentative. Again, these traits were harnessed by that phase of classical education, and so you learned how to argue your point. Hence the uh, philosophical discipline of logic. And all of this was done, including the grammar phase, was done utilizing the general subjects of the time, and uh, we have our analogs today: the sciences, history, literature, mathematics. All of those were used in concert to this approach. And the final phase of the trivium was the rhetoric phase, in which you learn to say what you mean what you say, and to do it with a degree of eloquence. And at that point, you were ready to enter the world in whatever trade you were going to ply your talents. The purpose of education being not to get a job, but to develop the skills of lifelong learning, autodidaction, because such a great measure of what we do in applying these things to life has to do with autodidaction, the teaching of yourself. And so the learning process never learns, and this was a chief virtue that was to be instilled by the trivium. And in some cases, students would go on to the equivalent of higher education in the ancient and medieval worlds, the quadrivium, again, which I'll talk about in a later episode. But for many centuries, this was the basis of education, and it eventually became Christianized during the period of late antiquity, the early church period and late antiquity, as many of the products of, let's say, schools like Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum, and the later versions, the early Christian era versions of those schools, the products of those schools began to convert to Christianity. And in fact, the literature of the entire early church is basically philosophical discourse between the pagan philosophers and the Christian philosophers. But gradually, classical education became Christianized because the Christians recognized that those virtues, the pursuit of what is good, what is true, what is beautiful, in their minds led them to Christ. And so theology and the biblical worldview became grafted onto that. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire, those classical traditions were in jeopardy. And on the fringes of Western civilization in the 5th century, the Irish were largely responsible for preserving classical tradition in Europe. Within a generation of being Christianized, they became the world's greatest scholars in Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. And so their monasteries always had scriptura and a scriptorum and a library in which manuscripts could be copied and stored as they found them. And if you fast forward a few centuries, during the later Dark Ages, Charlemagne knew that education was going to be very important in the progress of Europe. And so he hired a number of churchmen from the old Irish and British Isle tradition, notably Alcuin of York, to set up what he called palace schools. And lo and behold, what did they use? They used a Christianized version of the trivium and quadrivium system to lay the foundations for what would become the universities of Europe. That, of course, is a different story, but the bases for those are, in many ways, Charlemagne's palace schools, which are directly descended ideologically, intellectually, from the traditions in the Irish and British monastic communities. And so for centuries, this system of education, for whoever had access to it, and that would grow, particularly as literacy grew in Europe, This became the basis for uh, education, and it produced a number of polymaths over the years. People such as Galileo, Sir Isaac Newton, um, people like Shakespeare, Francis Bacon. Um, on this side of the pond, people like Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were products of classical education. Um, Much of that actually began in the home with the reading of the Bible and then tutoring in Latin and theology. Um, and so, with the advent of the High Middle Ages and the Renaissance, when all these classical virtues are being rediscovered and reapplied, classical education became firmly ensconced in Western tradition. And unfortunately, it fell out of favor with the advent of educators in this country like John Dewey, who thought that it was arcane and out of place. Um, However, the approach is not anachronistic. It produces results. It's not just a novelty. In many ways, it's a superior form to the curricula that are implemented in schools today. The tragedy of it is that classical methodology can be put to use in public and private schools. It is in many private schools and homeschool curricula, but it can be put to use and make a lot of chief improvements. Um, the great misfortune is that many schools produce students who are not ready to um, take on the tasks of the world because the curricula are so faulty that they don't produce reasoning skills. They teach for taking tests. Um, if you teach the material within the rubric of classical methodology, then other things like taking tests are going to take care of themselves, and you'll develop those those traits such as a love of lifelong learning, which of course you never stop learning. Like a shark in water, you have to keep moving forward. You're always having to learn something, and classical education harnesses that, develops it, and harnesses it. And so that is a rundown of what classical methodology is, what classical education is. I'll build on this in later episodes, but I wanted to talk a little bit about it today, particularly because education is on everybody's minds these days. It's very book-based, very reading heavy, very writing heavy, and I'll deal with these issues more in more detail in later episodes. If you want to learn more about the world from which this came, you could read books like the Short History of Greece, which you can buy from my store. I'll put a link in the description. You can also read essays like The Lost Tools of Learning by Dorothy Sayre. And there's also a really good address to the Classical Society of America from Calvin Coolidge, and I'll put links to those in the descriptions as well. Until next time, I will be thinking about these ideas for new episodes, and I will see you later, my Quick Classics friends. Godspeed.